Good morning. My name is Bob Holliday, and I live in West Des Moines, Iowa. And I've been asked to give this presentation to the Friends of the World War II Memorial. I'm pleased and honored to do that. I am a Gold Star son, having lost my dad in World War II. And he was born on and raised on a farm in southern Iowa. He was one of 7 kids raised in a farmhouse with a wood-burning stove. And he and a couple of his siblings managed to eventually go on to college. He graduated from Drake University here in Des Moines in 1941, and he was then drafted into the Army, took his basic at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and was eventually assigned to the artillery and took his OCS at Fort Sill, where he was commissioned. That's where he met my mother. And I was born on September 1, 1943, right near Camp Joseph Robinson in Little Rock, Arkansas. The battalion I'm going to tell you about was being formed at that point. I have, of course, no memory of that, for that matter. And he was a battery commander in the 561st Field Artillery Battalion. That battalion was known as a bastard battalion. That term came from the fact the battalion was not assigned or connected to a division. It was a separate corps battalion built into the system that provided additional firepower if a unit somewhere else needed it. They were trained to load up, move over, and provide more firepower. One of his fellow officers told me later that because of that, he thought that their unit had a little wider spectrum of the war than if they had been connected to a division. The battalion itself went ashore at Utah Beach at the war's end. They found themselves right at the Elbe River. They were in 5 major battles, lots of smaller ones. The 561st moved into the Schnee-Eifel area, which is right along the German-Belgian border, on October 3, 1944. They dug in around a little village called Schlierbach. That area of Europe has hundreds of little villages. Their farmers don't live in the land like ours do. The Schlierbach being one of those little villages, if you will. And with that said, they were there again until the bulge started on December 16th, 1944. They were at the exact spot, in fact, where that Field Marshal Gerd van Rundstedt sent those legions of German troopers against the American lines. Now, let me tell you a little bit, if I can, again, about the 561st. As in most American artillery battalions, that battalion was made up of 5 batteries. Infantry battalions have companies, artillery battalions have batteries. They had 3 firing batteries. Each one had 4 weapons, a 155 gun, which was affectionately called a long tom. They had service battery and headquarters battery. My dad was the commander of headquarters battery. Now, that was his job, and I could go on and on with detail about what that job encompassed, but I think it's important for anybody that listens to this to understand the makeup of an artillery battalion in those days. And I think that's the way it's probably geared today as well. Now, let me just say this as far as his death is concerned. They survived the Battle of the Bulge. They went on, and he was killed actually on April 13, 1945, in an ambush by German infantry. They were about 60, 70 miles due west of Berlin by a little German town called Klotz, Germany. He was in his Jeep with his Jeep driver and his battery clerk and his radio operator in a column of about 15 American vehicles. That convoy, if you will, was made up of vehicles from 3 different artillery battalions. The American Army was moving so fast in those days that was what they call an advance party, that convoy, and they were actually going forward to determine where these battalions would place their guns when they moved forward. Unfortunately, the colonel in that who was the leader of that battalion, violated actually an order and moved that convoy in front of the American infantry. Germans saw him coming and ambushed him. And all four in his Jeep were killed, for that matter, and he is buried along with his first sergeant, who was in the Jeep with him, in the American Military Cemetery in Margraten, Holland. The announcement of a death in World War II was handled entirely differently than what you may see today. I mean, God forbid if we lose someone today in a war, and we do, what happens, as you know, is that the family normally is paid a visit by a uniformed commissioned officer and perhaps a chaplain who brings that terrible news to the family. In World War II, such an announcement came by one sentence telegram. I still have the telegram for that matter. And the family was left to deal with it. I'm not complaining, I'm telling you that's how it was. And they just that's what happened in those days. Now, our country has come a long way in that regard, and I think it's a good thing for those left behind that it's treated entirely differently, for that matter. Now, what happened in my case is that my mother, who was only 18 years old at the time, when I was 2 years old, she actually handed me to my dad's older brother and his wife. By blood, they were my aunt and uncle. He was 13 years older than my dad. They already had 3 kids, again, which were my cousins by blood. I was 2 years old. I have no memory of any of that. The point I'm making in that regard is that unlike some people who I've run across now as an adult who lost their dad in World War II, I was actually raised in a wonderful family. My aunt and uncle, who again, at 2 years old without any memory, they were mom and dad to me. So I was raised in an environment of just a traditional good American family, the youngest of 4 kids, etc., for that matter. But here's something that comes into play in this, is that World War II, a lot of deaths were simply swept under the rug, including my father's. Nobody really talked about it. That's just the way it was. And so while I grew up and went through education and so forth, I mean, I knew I'd lost a dad in World War II, but I really was never in a position where I had to think about it. Well, that day changed when I was a sophomore in college. And if you look at a picture of 4 soldiers, the first guy is Jim Regner. He was from Aurora, Illinois. The second guy in was Charlie Turner, and he was from Russellville, Arkansas. Then there's my dad. And then on the right is a guy by the name of Chuck Stegner. Chuck Stegner was from Grangeville, Idaho. Those 4 guys really commanded the staff, if you will, of headquarters battery of the 561st Field Artillery Battalion. My dad was the commander. The other 3 guys were his lieutenants. But the man on the right, Chuck Stegner, when I was 20 years old, those guys had been looking for me. He came through Des Moines, and he found me. And I met him, and he regaled me a little bit with some stories and so forth. And for me, that sparked my interest in this. And from that time, for probably the next 30-plus years, I really put some study into that war, and particularly the part that my dad's artillery played in it. And let me just digress for a minute, and don't hold this against me, but I was a football official also for probably 35 to 40 years. And I always wanted to go to Europe and follow the route of travel that this 561st had used. And because I was an official, I never had time to do it. Well, my first year not being on the football field was 2001. By that time, I'd really studied this stuff. And again, let me digress for a minute. Because the fact that these people from the 561st, they're survivors, what they did with me is that they pulled me into their group and never let me out of it. So they were all friends of mine. There's actually 2 of these gentlemen still alive today. So from the time I was 20 years old up through many to today, these guys made me feel like I was part of that thing. I wasn't there. I'm not trying to say I was. But because of that, the time I went to Europe in 2001, I had some artifacts that allowed me to put together a trip beyond any of my beliefs that would ever happen. And here's what they consisted of. There was another gentleman from 561st by the name of Holden Rogers. Holden Rogers and Chuck Stegner had both been forward observers in that battalion. Now, for those of you that don't know what a forward observer is, that unquestionably is the most dangerous job in the artillery. A forward observer is the man who's either right with the infantry or sometimes in front of them, under concealment. In those days, he had a huge pair of binoculars, field glasses, called a battery commander scope. That man was wired in to the Fire Direction Center, probably 2 or 3 miles behind him. Fire Direction Center was part of Headquarters Battery. And the forward observer had maps that showed almost every fence post in the area. And so if he spotted a target with a system of grids on that map, he would then call back to the Fire Direction Center, and they would report that, and the guns would start zeroing in on that target. That gets pretty complicated. They had to be extremely well trained, and that's how it worked. So these forward observers, when they moved into an area, were issued these maps. And when they left, they turned them back in. Well, Holden Rogers did not turn his back in. He kept them. He became a dear friend of mine, as did his son, John Rogers, who is still a good friend of mine today. A couple other things I had. The Battalion XO, a man by the name of A.J. Gordon, a major, kept a diary. GIs in World War II were not to keep diaries. The command thought that if they got captured, the enemy could use them to advantage. But A.J. Gordon said, to heck with that. He kept a diary. So for years I had a diary. I knew exactly where they were every day, the route of travel, and how many rounds they fired, and what actions they'd been in. They were not to have cameras. Virgil Donzi, another officer, had a camera. He gave me the pictures. I've had all of those. And finally, back to Chuck Stegner. In 1986, he sat down with a tape recorder and recorded his memories of the Battle of the Bulge in complete detail, along with information about my dad. Now, this recording is a piece of work, and if anybody was ever interested in a battle, in particular the Bulge, I wish you could hear it sometime. It's a phenomenal piece of work. In 2001, again, I put together a trip to Europe that involved my son Greg, who was then in his mid-30s. It involved Chuck Stegner's son, Dave Stegner, and a fourth guy by the name of Terry Betcher. Terry Betcher is a friend of mine in Des Moines. Terry Betcher's father was Sergeant Don Betcher. Don Betcher was a belly gunner on a B-24 bomber in the 15th Air Force out of Venosa, Italy. Because of the fact that his plane, after 35 missions, had to make a belly landing, he received damages, I think, at that point to his kidneys. Unfortunately, in those days, he died 2 years later after that war because of that incident. So Terry Betcher went with us. And over the years, again, the 561st Field Artillery Battalion had reunions every other year. So I was fortunate to get to know the men, their families, their kids, and I want to say, too, that I'm still very good friends with particularly a couple of them, which would be Chuck Stegner's son, Holden Rogers' son, John Rogers. You'll see some pictures of those guys. So, in September of 2001, the four of us who I mentioned took off for Europe. And we started, at Utah Beach. And we followed that battalion using A.J. Gordon's diary and Holman Rogers maps up through the Battle of the Bulge. And I want to talk about that for just a minute. If you look at a picture of Dave Stegner and myself, we're looking at a map. That is one of Holman Rogers' maps. That picture was taken in our first night in Normandy before we started out on this adventure. The next picture you're looking at is of three guys standing on Utah Beach. And the left is my son Greg, that's me, and then Dave Stegner. On September the 11th, 2001, we all know what date that was, but the four of us, guys, were standing on Omaha Beach when those planes hit the towers in New York City. Place I'll never forget, of course, for both those reasons, meaning where we were, and number two, what happened when we were there. So you know what did happen was a gentleman, I think he was from Belgium. He recognized us as Americans. He had a cell phone, and somebody had told him about this, and he walked up and told us about it. In any event, that's a little side note to that trip. And that trip lasted a couple of weeks. Back to my friend Holman Rogers, the forward observer, and his son John Rogers. Holman's first day in combat of the 561st of the forward observer was on the top of Hill 131 in Normandy. We wanted to get to the top of that hill. Holman had never been back. We were there. We wanted to find it and photograph one. That picture you're looking at, barnyard, I guess, with brick buildings in it, was owned by a couple that owned the hill. The gentleman wasn't home, but the lady was, and she took us to the top of that hill. Picked up some rocks, later giving them to Holman Rogers. But the next picture, if you will, shows Terry Betcher, my son Greg, and the woman who owned the property. Greg has something in his hand. Now, if you look at the next picture, you'll see what that something is. That is a photograph that she handed us. Now, I've seen that photograph in countless books, but that was a famous photograph of then General Omar Bradley pinning what I think is the Distinguished Service Cross on some American airborne troopers. And it was taken right in that spot from the previous picture. We were standing on some pretty hollow ground there. The next picture shows quite a beautiful home covered with vines. That is a picture of the lady's aunt. What we did, she walked us behind her property to her aunt's property, probably a couple hundred yards back through the woods. That's where her aunt lived in World War II. She had been a teenager living there with her parents. That house was General Omar Bradley's Normandy headquarters, and we were told that we were the first Americans back into that house. We walked into things in that trip we never expected. The next picture you'll see is 5 people. On the right is Terry Betcher. There's me. There's Dave Stegner. There's a gentleman in a white and black coat. His name was Joseph Rausch. And to the left is Nicholas Werner. When we got to the Battle of the Bulge into the Schnee Eifel area, the 2 gentlemen on the left were natives to the area. They both were dairy farmers. Now, Joseph Rausch, the guy in the white coat with the black trim, lived in a little village called Gross Langenfeld. Again, I'd repeat that the farmers don't live on the land like ours do. That's where he lived. In fact, he told us that his family had had that ground for 250 years. When Joseph Rausch was 16 years old, he was drafted into the German army, took his training as an anti-tank man in Norway, and fought against the Americans right there in his hometown. Met him, and I thought, I do not want to be friends with a former German soldier. But you know something? We spent 4 days with him, and I'm so glad I did. He helped us find stuff in that area we never would have found, and I'll get into that in a minute. Conversely, Nicholas Werner, to the left, was a real young kid. He was not in the German army, but he told great stories about how men from the 2nd American Infantry Division had lived in his house, etc. He lived in a little village in that area called Aw, A-U-W. But both of those guys helped us find stuff in the area that we never would have found. There's a picture of Dave Stegner and I standing by a sign that says Schlierbach St. Vith. St. Vith is the larger community in that area. Fought over hard in the Battle of the Bulge because it had crossroads. It had roads coming in from different directions. Both parties wanted it, both sides. Schlerbach, of course, is the town, the little village where the 561st Field Artillery Battalion moved into on October the 3rd, 1944. What we found, I'm going to tell you what we found because of Holman Rogers' forward observation maps, which we had with us. I had visited with Holman before we went to Europe, and he marked certain things in those maps, so we took them to Europe with us, for that matter. Now, one of the things that happened when the 561st moved into Schlerbach, Belgium, which, by the way, it's right on the German border. If you had a good arm, you could stand in Schlerbach and throw a baseball into Germany. But in any event, the 5 batteries of the 561st, they moved into that area, spread out because of possible German airplanes and bombing and all that stuff. But back to the picture of my dad and his 3 lieutenants, Jim Regner, Charlie Turner, and Chuck Stegner. They went 100 or 200 yards out into the woods. And the next picture you'll see is black and white, and it's dark. What that is, those guys dug a hole in the ground, cut those logs, lined it with logs, found some corrugated tin, put a roof on it, and a tarp over that, and that was their home until the Battle of the Bulge started. Chuck Stegner told me they had to crawl on your belly to get into the thing. That's one of the pictures that came to me from Virgil Donzi, who had all the pictures of those days. Now, the next picture you'll see is Dave Stegner and me standing in a hole. That's the hole where that cabin was. They called it the cabin, by the way. That's the hole where that structure was that my dad and the 3 gentlemen, the 3 lieutenants, built. And we found that because Holman Rogers had marked it on his forward observation map. Joseph Rouse, the former soldier, and Nicholas Warner helped us find that. So that trip was just unbelievable as finding things. The next picture is I simply threw this in here. This is a picture of Terry Betcher standing at the place where the Malmedy massacre took place. For those of you who don't know what that is, that was in the Bulge when the Germans captured, I believe it was an artillery observation battalion, over 100 men, and they lined them up in that field and machine gunned them. 85 or 6 Americans died from that thing. It was just a horrible thing. It was a war crime. Again, that's pretty hallowed ground, and it was a spot we wanted to visit, for that matter. Now, the next picture I'm including in this is a picture of Holman Rogers, the forward observer that had the observation maps that he brought back from Europe. That's me with him, and that's standing in front of the 155 long-tom guns. That gun is on display at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Fort Sill being, of course, the headquarters of the American artillery for years and years, as it was in World War II. So I'm going to show you that. And the next to the last picture is a picture of myself and Holman Rogers' son John. In 2010, John Rogers and I and 2 other guys went back to the Bulge area. That's us standing in that area. John Rogers, again, who's the son of Holman Rogers, and I are very close friends, as are Dave Stegner and myself. And through those friendships, we've had some incredible adventures together. War is a terrible thing, but I can say without hesitation, when your dad's in the thing, whether they came back or not, you want to know what happened. Now, the last photograph that you'll see is a picture of 4 people standing at my dad's grave in Margot, Holland, and I'll identify them. On the right is my son Greg. On the left is, and the lady with me is a married couple. They live close to that cemetery. They're Dutch, and probably 25 or 30 years ago. That's the couple that adopted his grave in Margot, Holland. The Dutch people, I'm telling you, are so appreciative to this day of what the Americans did for them in freeing their country from the oppression and the Nazis, that these feelings of gratitude to the Americans, they're on their third generation. That kind of thing has been passed down to grandkids. And I think it's just unbelievable what they'll do. I get, they will text me, they'll email me photographs of certain days in the cemetery and so forth. They stay in touch. They're just wonderful people, and they love the Americans. They do. I think the difference is that war was not fought on our soil, was not fought on our ground. Had it been, people around our own country would probably realize more so what happened in that war and study a little more. Now, let me just end this with this. Okay, what have I learned from all this? Let me back up a minute. Again, I repeat that until I was 20 years old, I didn't really have to give it much of a thought until my dad's fellow officers and pals from that battalion got a hold of me. And again, I'd repeat here that absolutely, got my attention. I started studying it. I also would tell you that when I was in high school, I had a couple of athletic coaches, Bobby Anderson and Charlie Mcguire. Those names mean not much to you, but I'll tell you what, those two guys had found themselves as college roommates in a little school here in Iowa, a little college called Cornell in Mount Vernon, Iowa. Bob Anderson, Andy was a basketball player, Charlie was a wrestler. They were roommates. They both were lieutenants in the Marine Corps in the Pacific, in the same regiment. They both were combat veterans. Then they both coached and taught together. I mean, you talk about a friendship. Any event, somewhere along the line, those two guys heard my story. I didn't tell them. I was a high school kid. But they raised me accordingly, if you will. I was one of their athletes. I think maybe as I look back in a good way, they're a little harder on me, which is fine. But I can see right now as an adult what they did. The other thing that happened to me was that as a football official, when I was hired to become a part of the staff of the former Big 8 football conference, the supervisor of officials was a guy by the name of Bruce Finlinson. He also had been a Marine Corps officer in that war. And again, I didn't tell him my story. Somebody did. I can't tell you who it was, but he treated me accordingly as well. And what I've learned, there's two things I've learned about all of that. Number one is the fact that I don't think there's anything in existence that'll build camaraderie closer, quicker than facing a common enemy. The second thing I've learned is this. This country is the freest country in the history of this planet. If you want a war, you're nuts. Yet war has been a major historical fact for this country. Our wars have not been fought to gain ground and hold it, to steal ground from people, or to put our way of life on other people. Our wars have been fought to protect our freedoms and the freedoms of other freedom-loving people in this world. So I have the utmost respect and admiration for anybody that's worn that uniform for this country. Not just World War II. I'm not saying that at all. Any of them. These young people today that go to war, they are putting themselves out for us, for everybody listening to this, and everybody within the four corners in Hawaii and Alaska in this country. They're protecting your freedom. It's that simple. So that's the second lesson I've learned from this. I've got some pretty strong feelings about that one. That's my story. Thank you for letting me present it. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.